It was a stormy Friday evening when I found myself seeking refuge in the old Oakridge Public Library. The heavy rain made the cobblestone streets slick, and the flickering streetlights seemed eager to vanish into the darkness. I was new in town and had heard little about the library, just whispers from locals that it held more than dusty books and cobwebbed shelves. Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew, but the warmth was inviting. Rows of towering mahogany bookshelves stretched endlessly, their contents spilling onto the creaky wooden floors. It was oddly quiet, too quiet for a public space. The librarian stood at the front desk, her presence unnerving from the moment I stepped inside. She was tall and gaunt, her pale face framed by jet black hair tied into a severe bun. Her eyes were small and darted nervously, as if scanning for unseen trespassers. She wore an old-fashioned dress with high collars, her hands gloved despite the absence of any chill inside. "Looking for something specific?" she said in a voice that crackled like the pages of an ancient tome. "No, just browsing," I replied, forcing a polite smile. Her gaze lingered a moment too long before she gestured toward the back shelves. "Stay out of the restricted section," she warned me, her voice colder now. "And remember, the library closes at 9 o'clock sharp." I nodded and wandered off, my curiosity piqued. The restricted section? That sounded interesting. As I walked through the aisles, the books seemed to whisper. I chalked it up to the old building and the storm outside. The further I went, the darker it got, until I stumbled upon a shelf with a faded brass plaque that read, "Restricted." A heavy chain wrapped around the rows of books, locked tight. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning sharply, I saw no one, but I felt a chill that prickled the back of my neck. I hurried back toward the main area, but the librarian was nowhere to be found. The clock on the wall read 8:57 p.m. Just as I turned to leave, the lights flickered violently, and the entire room plunged into darkness. My pulse quickened. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight, but before I could, I heard a low, guttural voice right behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the librarian's pale face, now twisted in a grotesque grin. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her gloved hands were reaching for me, trembling with anticipation. Panicked, I bolted down an aisle, my footsteps echoing through the empty library. Books flew from the shelves, pages ripping themselves apart in the air. The whispering grew louder behind me. I tripped over an overturned stool and hit the floor hard. The flashlight skittered away, plunging me into near complete darkness. Crawling forward, I could feel the librarian's presence closing in, her wheezing breath and soft laughter growing louder and louder. Finally, my hand landed on the flashlight. I swung it around, the beam catching her inches from my face. Her mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "You wanted the restrictions section? You've earned your place inside of it." I screamed and swung the flashlight at her. She shrieked and recoiled, her form flickering into a broken film reel. I scrambled to my feet and ran, weaving through the labyrinth aisles until I reached the entrance. The door wouldn't budge. Desperately, I threw my shoulder against it. The clock above the door struck 9 o'clock, and the librarian's voice boomed from behind me. 9 o'clock. Time to shelve you." With one final push, the door bursted open, and I tumbled into the rain-soaked street. I didn't look back. I didn't care to see if she was watching me or following me from the windows. The next morning, I returned with the police, but the library was gone. Where the building once stood was now an overgrown lot, the ground covered in wildflowers. When I told my story, they simply shook their heads and did not believe me. That library burned down 50 years ago, one of the officers told me. But I still have the scar on my arm, a deep, jagged scratch, and an old library card I didn't have before that night. It reads, Oakridge Public Library. Late fees apply. It was a typical Wednesday evening at the Willow Creek Library. The place wasn't fancy, just a small brick building with stained carpets and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. I've been coming here now every evening for the past 2 weeks, typing up to finish one of my college research papers in peace. It wasn't the most inspiring place, but it was quiet, usually. That night, I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. The main area was nearly empty except for the librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, and a couple of regulars buried in books. I set up my laptop in my favorite spot, a table near the back, next to a window that overlooked the dark parking lot. But tonight, there was something off. As I settled in, I noticed him. A man sitting in the farthest corner of the library. His wild, matted hair was streaked with gray, and his clothes were filthy, layers upon layers that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. He was hunched over a table covered in papers, muttering to himself and scribbling furiously. Mrs. Hargrove had warned me about him before. Yeah, he comes in sometimes. Doesn't bother anyone. But don't get too close. He's a little unstable. I tried to ignore him and focus on my work, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Every now and then, he would stop scribbling, glance up, and stare towards my direction. His eyes were bloodshot. His gaze was intense, almost predatory. I told myself he was harmless, just a man with nowhere else to go. When the library clock chimed to 8 o'clock, things started to get strange. The muttering grew louder, and I could make out fragments of his words. They're watching, always watching. Gotta finish before they find me. I glanced over at Mrs. Hargrove. She was busy sorting books, oblivious to the old man's ramblings. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. When they came back on, I realized the man was no longer at his table. He was standing, and he was staring right at me. I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. He was holding one of his papers in his hand, crumpled up and shaking. Slowly, he began to walk towards me, his heavy boots thudding against the thin carpet. Do you see them? Do you see them too? I didn't know what to say. I don't know what you mean, sir. He slammed the paper down on my table. It was covered in bizarre symbols, scribbles, and jagged lines as if drawn by someone in a frenzy. They're here. In the walls, in the books. They hide, but they're watching us. Mrs. Hargrove called out from the distance. Sir, you need to keep your voice down. The man's head snapped toward her, and his face twisted into a snarl. She's one of them. She's part of it. I grabbed my laptop and stood up, intending to leave, but the man slammed his hand on my arm. His grip was like iron. Don't go. If you leave now, they'll take you. Let me go, I said, trying to pull free. Before he could say anything else, Mrs. Hargrove appeared with a security guard. "Sir, please leave now." The man finally released me, his wild eyes darting between all of us. "You don't understand. They're in the books." The guard took him by the arm and started to escort him out. Security came over and took him by the arm and started to escort him outside. As he was dragged away, he shouted one final warning. "Don't read. Don't let them in." The door slammed shut behind him, and silence returned. I let out a shaky breath and sat back down, trying to convince myself that he was just an old, delusional man, but his words lingered on. I should have left then. I should have walked out and never come back. Instead, I picked up the paper he'd left on my table, curious to spite myself. The symbols meant nothing to me, but the writing at the bottom sent a chill down my spine. "They come when you know." I looked up at the bookshelves, suddenly aware of how the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Then I heard a soft, rustling sound, like pages turning, but no one else was inside the library. When I turned back to my laptop, the screen was black, and reflected in the dark screen was a shape standing behind me, something tall, with two long fingers and hollow, empty eyes. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The last thing I heard was the sound of pages turning faster and faster until everything went dark. They found my things the next morning. My laptop, my bag, even my notebook. But I wasn't there. The only thing left on the table was a single sheet of paper. It read, "They took her too." It was a chilly Thursday evening, and the Crestview Library was quieter than usual. I liked it that way. I was a grad student working on my thesis, and the library's second floor, with its tall bookshelves and cozy reading nooks, was my favorite spot to study. The library itself was a mix of old and new. The main floor had been renovated with modern desks and bright lights, but the upper floor retained its vintage charm, dusty shelves, worn carpet, and that faint, comforting smell of old paper. It always felt like a safe place. Until that night. I sat down at my usual table in the back corner, surrounded by piles of books. It was so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of pages from the handful of people scattered across the floor. And that's when I noticed him. He was sitting 3 tables away from me, wearing a gray hoodie pulled low over his face. At first, I thought he was just another late-night student. But something about him felt off. He wasn't reading or writing. He was just sitting there, staring in my direction. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. I buried myself in my research paper, but every time I glanced up, his gaze hadn't shifted. About an hour had passed, and the unease in my stomach grew. I gathered my books and moved to a different table, closer to the stairs. But as I sat down, I felt a presence. He had moved as well. Now this time he was at a table directly across from mine, still not pretending to do anything but watch me. I tried to focus on my laptop, telling myself I was just overreacting. But then I heard it. The faint sound of a chair sliding against the floor. I glanced up and froze. He was standing now, slowly walking toward me. His hood still obscured most of his face, but I could see his lips twitching into a faint, unsettling smile. That was the last straw. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and hurried downstairs to the main floor. Our librarian, Mrs. Bennett, was sitting at the front desk. "Everything okay, dear?" she asked, looking up from her crossword puzzle. "There's a man upstairs. He's following me." Her expression darkened. "Stay here. I'll notify the police." She picked up the phone and dialed, her voice calm but firm as she explained the situation. Meanwhile, I glanced toward the staircase, half expecting him to appear. And then he did. He was standing at the top of the stairs, just watching me, his head tilted slightly, as if amused by my fear. When he noticed me looking, he started descending, slowly, deliberately. "Lock the door!" Mrs. Bennett hurried to the entrance, fumbling with the keys as the man continued down the staircase. I pressed myself against the front desk, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. Before he reached the bottom step, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the library's front windows. Then, without warning, he bolted back up the stairs. 2 officers burst through the door seconds later, guns drawn. "Where is he?" one of them demanded. I pointed toward the staircase. "Upstairs." They rushed up, their footsteps echoing through the building. I stood frozen, Mrs. Bennett's trembling hand on my shoulder as we waited in silence. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, until one of the officers returned. His face was pale. "There's no one up there." "What?" He went upstairs. You must have missed him." The officer shook his head. "We checked every corner. There's no sign of him." They reviewed the library's security footage, but it was as if the man had vanished. One moment he was there, walking up the stairs, and the next, the cameras glitched, showing nothing but static. I didn't sleep that night, or the nights that followed. The police promised to keep an eye on the area, but I knew they didn't believe me. Weeks later, I tried to return to the library, hoping to move on, but as I approached the 2nd floor, I felt a chill creep up my spine. On the table where I'd first sat that night was a single sheet of paper. Scrawled across it, in shaky, uneven handwriting, were the words, "I'll always be watching."